In a quiet suburban neighborhood, an aging dog lay peacefully in the sun, basking in the warmth of his own backyard. What began as an ordinary, tranquil afternoon quickly spiraled into something unfair and unsettling for the defenseless pup. Yet, just as it seemed that the old dog had no one to protect him, his owner arrived, turning the whole situation on its head. How could a loyal, elderly dog provoke such chaos, and what led these officers to cross the line? Mark Winters had spent nearly 12 years with his cherished German Shepherd mix, Duke, a gray-muzzled companion who spent countless afternoons dozing by the garden fence. Life in their quiet suburban neighborhood was idyllic, with neighbors exchanging friendly waves and local kids riding their bikes until dusk. But one day, that peace was shattered. Duke, now an elderly dog in his twilight years, typically spent his midday naps beneath a patch of sunlit grass. Mark had gone out for errands, expecting no surprises. He never imagined returning to find two police officers hovering over his dog, their voices raised, the tension in the air palpable. A neighbor, hearing the commotion, peeked through a window, and what she saw shocked her. The old dog, cowering near the fence, while the officers barked commands with an authority that seemed excessive. Duke's only reaction was a low, pitiful whine, his tired eyes reflecting confusion and fear. The word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Something was happening at Mark's house. The cops were hassling his old dog. Some feared Duke was being accused of aggression or nuisance, while others were concerned about potential animal cruelty. By the time Mark's car rolled up, the situation looked grim. Duke was pressed against the fence, trembling under the officer's stern gestures. What had provoked this scene? A witness later explained that the police had received an anonymous complaint about a dangerous dog roaming yards. But Duke's cloudy eyes and unsteady legs told a very different story. He barely ventured more than a few feet from his food bowl these days. Mark's heart pounded with a mix of anger and protectiveness when he saw his old friend trapped. Determined to defend Duke, he stepped out of his car, adrenaline surging. The officers quickly turned, their eyes darting between him and Duke, unsure how he would react. In that moment, a confrontation was brewing, one that would not only reveal the truth behind the call, but also challenge assumptions about loyalty, authority, and the quiet strength of an old dog who simply wanted to snooze in the sun. Little did anyone know, what would unfold next would force everyone, neighbors, police, and even Mark himself, to reconsider where the line was between caution and harassment, between fear and compassion. Mark Winters could hardly believe his eyes. His gentle old dog, Duke, who spent his days lounging under the sun, now stood trembling in his own backyard, surrounded by two uniformed police officers. Their voices were unnecessarily loud, too loud, Mark thought, and the tension was palpable. Duke's muzzle was streaked with gray, and his joints had become stiff over the years. Menacing was the last word anyone would use to describe him. And yet, there he was, backed into the fence, looking confused and scared as the officers loomed over him. The moment Mark stepped out of his car, the officers spun around, their eyes flicking nervously between him and Duke. Still shaking with anger, Mark hurried toward them. "What's going on?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady despite the rising frustration. One officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man, responded sharply, "We received a call about a dangerous dog roaming the yards." His hand hovered near his utility belt, making Mark's stomach twist with concern. The second officer, shorter and with a more uncertain expression, glanced nervously at Duke. Mark shook his head in disbelief. Dangerous. He's old. He barely leaves this spot anymore. Duke let out a soft, mournful whine, his paws scraping weakly at the grass. This was no aggressive animal, no wild beast. If anything, Duke was the one feeling harassed, trapped between two strangers in uniform who towered over him, their presence threatening. The whole scene felt absurd to Mark. Trying to diffuse the situation, Mark took a slow, measured step toward Duke. He crouched down, speaking softly. "Hey, buddy, it's okay?" With careful hands, he stroked Duke's back, feeling the rapid thud of his heart. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The tall officer frowned. "Sir, please step back. We need to assess this dog. We were informed he might have snapped at someone." Mark narrowed his eyes. "Snapped at who? He can barely stand on his own some days." He noticed Miss R. Flanagan, a neighbor, peeking through her curtain. She made a subtle gesture, silently signaling that she knew Duke wasn't dangerous. The shorter officer hesitated. "We got a complaint from a neighbor about an aggressive dog barking and chasing kids." He looked at Duke again, his expression faltering. "Could it have been a mix-up?" Mark exhaled, frustration bubbling. "It's definitely a mix-up. Duke's never chased anyone, not even a squirrel these days. Maybe you got the wrong house." The tall officer crossed his arms, standing firm. "We followed up on the call. The address matched. We also saw him loose in the yard and responding aggressively when we arrived." "Responding aggressively?" Mark echoed, his voice sharp. "He's old and scared. You're strangers yelling at him in his own backyard." An awkward silence settled between them. The taller officer was resolute, unwilling to acknowledge the mistake, while the shorter officer seemed to falter, his unease growing as he began to realize the situation wasn't what they'd been told. Mark gently stroked Duke's ears, trying to soothe the dog, whose trembling grew worse. "Are you two just barging into private property on a bad tip?" Mark continued, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "Now you're doubling down instead of admitting you might have been wrong." The taller officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, lower your voice." His tone was stern, but Mark could sense the defensiveness beneath it. "We're just doing our job." "That's fine," Mark retorted, "but your job also involves recognizing when there's no real threat. Look at him." He gestured at Duke, whose rapid breathing betrayed his fear. From the other side of the fence, a neighbor chimed in. "Duke's been around forever. He's as gentle as they come." "Are you sure you've got the right dog?" The officers turned to look, surprised by the voice but unable to see who it was. The neighbor remained partially hidden behind the fence, unwilling to get too involved but eager to defend Duke's reputation. Curiosity in the suburban neighborhood spread quickly, and soon a small crowd had gathered near the property line. Some filmed the encounter on their phones, others shouting opinions like, "He's just an old dog, leave him alone," and "The cops shouldn't be harassing harmless animals." The tension escalated with each passing moment. Overwhelmed by the growing voices and stares, Duke let out a low, mournful howl. Mark placed a hand on his dog's scruff, whispering, "Hang in there, buddy. We'll fix this." The older officer seemed to bristle at the increasing scrutiny, his posture stiffening as if worried about losing control of the situation. The shorter officer, noticing the shift in sentiment, cleared his throat. "Maybe we should verify the dog's paperwork, sir," he suggested, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Proof of vaccination, licensing, that could help clarify things." Mark nodded, relieved at the opportunity to de-escalate. "Fine, let me grab his records from inside." With a pointed look at the taller officer, he added, "But Duke's staying right here with me. You don't need to handle him." The tall officer didn't move, but reluctantly stepped back, allowing Mark to guide Duke toward the back door. They moved slowly, Duke's joints creaking with age, each step a struggle. Onlookers parted, murmuring gentle encouragements to Duke. "Hang in there, old boy." Inside, Mark fetched Duke's vet records from a dusty folder. The anger was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep sadness. The thought of Duke, his loyal companion, being harassed in his final years stung more than any personal insult. When Mark returned outside, the officers examined the documents, confirming that Duke was vaccinated, microchipped, and licensed with the city. The shorter officer glanced at the paperwork, then at Duke, who was still trembling. "Everything checks out," he said softly, his voice sympathetic as he met the taller officer's gaze, signaling for him to back down. The tall officer let out a sigh, nodding reluctantly. "Looks like it was a mistake after all." A moment of silence passed over the backyard. The neighbors, still holding their phones, waited for the officers to make their final move. The tall officer exhaled slowly, his posture stiff as he took a step forward. "We apologize for the confusion," he said, his tone somewhat stiff but tinged with an unmistakable sincerity. "We received a report about a dangerous dog, and we reacted based on that information." Mark gave a small nod, his voice measured but sharp. "I get you were doing your job, but next time, maybe take a moment to assess the situation before you scare an old dog half to death." The officer's jaw tightened as though he wanted to argue, but the crowd's silent gaze and the dog's obvious frailty seemed to dampen any inclination to push back further. "Understood," he muttered. With that, the two officers turned, walking away from the backyard. A few neighbors muttered their disapproval, and Miss Flanagan, ever the outspoken one, gave a slow, mocking clap as the officers retreated. They stiffened but didn't say a word as they left. As soon as the officers were out of sight, Mark knelt down beside Duke, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. The old dog exhaled shakily, pressing his muzzle into Mark's chest. Soft murmurs of comfort echoed from the neighbors who remained. "Good boy, Duke. You're safe now." But as Mark wrapped his arms around Duke, he couldn't shake the image of the officers looming over his dog, their voices raised, commanding. What if the neighbors hadn't intervened? What if no one had stepped in to stop it? That thought alone stirred a new, fierce determination inside Mark to never let something like this happen again. Duke might have been old, but he still deserved respect, peace, and dignity, especially in his own backyard. Mark couldn't help but think that if the officers had approached the situation differently, this entire misunderstanding might never have escalated. In that moment, he realized it wasn't just about Duke. This incident represented something larger. If fear and assumptions were allowed to rule, the whole neighborhood could end up suffering. An unsettling quiet hung in the yard after the officers left, and a few neighbors lingered near the fence, talking in hushed voices. Duke, still shaken, pressed his muzzle against Mark's leg, seeking reassurance. Mark bent down, gently rubbing Duke's ears, his anger slowly giving way to sadness. Mrs. Flanagan, ever the concerned neighbor, stepped forward, her face etched with worry. "Mark, are you both okay?" she asked in a soft voice. "That was intense." Mark nodded, offering a small smile despite the tension still simmering inside. "We're fine now. Thanks for speaking up earlier. Your help made a difference." From the corner of the yard, Mr. Leonard, an older man with a cane, shook his head. "Can't believe they thought Duke was a threat. Poor dog's just bones and arthritis." The comment only fueled Mark's frustration. He couldn't fathom how two officers had come into his yard, assumed the worst about an elderly dog, and treated him like a criminal. What if Duke had been more spry or more aggressive? Would it have been even worse? "I just don't get it," Mark muttered under his breath. Why would they react like that to a dog who can barely move? Mrs. Flanagan gave him a sympathetic look. People hear something, jump to conclusions. They should have known better. Mark sighed, his hand gently stroking Duke's back as the dog nuzzled closer. Yeah, they should have. But I won't let this happen again. Not to him. Not to anyone's dog. With one last affectionate pat on Duke's head, Mark guided him back inside the house, locking the door behind them as though to shut out the world and its harshness. For now, they were safe. But Mark's vigilance had just begun. Later, Mark sent a message to his neighbors, suggesting they work together to keep an eye on the stray dog that had caused concern in the neighborhood. To his surprise, his inbox quickly filled with supportive responses. Mrs. Flanagan offered to set up a humane trap, and Mr. Leonard suggested installing a motion-activated camera near his trash cans. Even Officer Reed, who had been involved in the earlier incident, expressed his willingness to help. The community was rallying together, determined to prevent another misunderstanding and to ensure the stray dog's safety. Further investigation revealed that the dog, named Scout, had been reported missing months ago from a neighboring town. It seemed that Scout had wandered into the neighborhood by chance. The revelation shifted the narrative. What had initially been a source of fear turned into a story of compassion. The stray dog was no longer a threat. He was a lost animal in need of help. Mark realized that responding to fear with empathy and understanding was the right approach. Officer Reed, who had been part of the earlier tension with Duke, came to Mark's door to apologize for his part in the overreaction. They spoke about the situation, and Reed offered to assist with animal control. Together, they agreed to set up a safe trap to capture Scout. After several attempts, the community, with the help of Officer Reed, finally captured the stray dog. When Linda, Scout's original owner, arrived, a tearful reunion took place. Linda had been searching for Scout since he escaped from a boarding facility months earlier. The neighborhood's efforts had paid off, and Scout was safely returned to his loving owner. The experience led to a shift within the community. Mark's story, starting with fear and misunderstanding, became a catalyst for change. It sparked a more compassionate approach to handling animal-related incidents. The local police department pledged to revise their response protocols, and Mark offered to help train officers on how to handle similar situations with care and empathy. The neighborhood, once divided by tension, came together for a potluck in Mark's backyard. Neighbors, officers, and volunteers mingled, celebrating Scout's rescue. The event, which had begun with fear, now buzzed with laughter, goodwill, and a renewed sense of unity. Though life in the neighborhood returned to normal, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. He remained cautious, wondering if a similar misunderstanding might happen again. However, the support from his neighbors, the apology from Officer Reed, and the successful rescue of Scout gave him hope. The events had led to growth, understanding, and change, not only for his neighborhood, but also for the police department. Inspired by Duke's ordeal and Scout's rescue, Miss Flanagan suggested Mark organize an awareness event for the community. It could feature a short demonstration of dog-friendly policing, perhaps with the newly trained officers, and highlight the importance of understanding canine body language. Bridging the gap, as she called it, would show people that not every dog complaint needed to end in fear and aggression. We'd love to involve Duke too, as an ambassador for senior pets, if he's up for it, she said, smiling. Mark's heart lifted at the idea. He could help prevent another dog from facing the stress Duke had endured. I'm in, he agreed, imagining a day of stalls, workshops, and pamphlets. As long as Duke's comfortable, he's not exactly a puppy anymore. With that, Mark reached out to Officer Reed, hoping the department would participate. Reed's enthusiastic response reassured him that this new chapter of understanding and empathy had only just begun. "We've actually started a new training segment for rookies on handling pet calls," Reed explained over the phone. "We might be able to do a short demonstration, show how to approach a dog calmly, use non-threatening posture. It sounds like a great idea." Still, Reed warned Mark that not all officers were on board. Some felt the department had been unfairly criticized for just doing their job, and they might see it as a forced apology. Mark sighed, remembering the tension at the potluck where a few uniformed officers had hovered with guarded expressions. "If it helps even a few officers or neighbors, it's worth a try," he said. A week later, Mark visited the precinct in person for the first time since lodging his informal complaints. As he walked through the doors, a subtle hush descended. A few officers recognized him as the dog man, offering curious or sympathetic glances. Perhaps they recalled the public outcry or the local news coverage following the misidentification of Duke. Spotting Reed near a bulletin board, Mark offered a friendly nod. "Glad you came," Reed said, extending a handshake. "We just had a meeting about the outreach event." He pulled out a sheet of paper with a list of potential demonstration points: calm approach, reading dog signals, verifying reports, and distinguishing an aggressive dog from one that's anxious or just barking. Mark scanned the list, a small smile forming. "This is good. If we'd had this information weeks ago." He trailed off, not wanting to dwell on the past, but Reed nodded grimly, finishing the thought for him. "Then we wouldn't have traumatized your old friend." Later that afternoon, Mark took Duke to the vet for a routine senior checkup, given the stress the dog had recently endured. Dr. Menendez, their longtime vet, was relieved to see that Duke's heart rate and weight hadn't worsened. "He's a tough old boy," Dr. Menendez said, patting Duke's side. "The stress might have given him some sleepless nights, but physically, he's holding up. Just keep an eye on those joints." Mark exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So, he's good to go for a small public event in a few days?" The vet chuckled. "If it's not too overwhelming, sure. Just watch for signs of fatigue, and if he wants to lie down, let him." As Mark left the vet's office, his phone buzzed. The screen displayed an unknown number. He hesitated, but answered. A woman's nervous, halting voice introduced herself. "Hello, I'm the one who wrote you that letter. The mother who called the police about the dangerous dog." Mark froze, his heart pounding. This was his first time speaking to her. He stammered. "Thank you for reaching out." She sighed, her voice thick with regret. "I'm truly sorry. My kids were scared by a big dog in the alley, and I guess Duke fit the description. I never expected the cops to be so aggressive. I wanted to come see him, apologize in person." Her voice quivered with remorse, and Mark felt a surge of conflicting emotions: anger, empathy, relief. "All right," he said gently. "If you really want to, we can meet. Duke's older, but he's friendly." "I'd like to clear the air," she said. They arranged a meeting at Mark's yard, the very place where the incident had occurred. Mark's nerves were on edge. Would she be standoffish, or would she truly show remorse? The neighborly potluck had glossed over the call's source, and while many speculated the new family on the block might be responsible, no one knew for sure. As the meeting day approached, along with the shelter's outreach event, Mark cycled between tension and cautious hope. If this mother truly never intended harm, maybe they could finally bridge the misunderstanding and bring closure to Duke's ordeal. Ms. Flanagan, hearing the news, offered her moral support. "And if she tries to blame you again, we'll set the record straight," she added, winking. Duke, for his part, went about his day like nothing had happened. He napped, stretched out in a sunbeam, and occasionally ambled to the fence to greet passers-by with a wag of his tail. Mark patted Duke's side, finding comfort in the dog's calm. "We'll get through this final chapter, buddy," he thought. "Then maybe we can rest easy." "We've started a new training segment for rookies on handling pet calls," he explained over the phone. "We might be able to do a short demonstration, show them how to approach a dog calmly, use non-threatening body language. I think it's a great idea." Still, Reed cautioned Mark that not everyone was on board. Some officers felt the department had already taken too much heat for simply doing their job, and they might view this as an unnecessary apology. Mark sighed, recalling the tension from the potluck, where a few officers had hovered, their expressions cautious and guarded. "If it helps even a few officers or neighbors, it's worth a shot," he said. A week later, Mark visited the precinct in person for the first time since lodging his informal complaints. As he stepped inside, a quiet hush seemed to settle over the room. A few officers recognized him as the Dog Man, casting curious or sympathetic glances. Perhaps they remembered the public uproar or the local news coverage following the misidentification of Duke. Spotting Reed near a bulletin board, Mark offered a friendly nod. "Glad you made it," Reed said, extending a handshake. "We just had a meeting about the outreach event." He pulled out a piece of paper listing possible demonstration points: calm approach, reading dog signals, thoroughly verifying reports, and distinguishing between a truly aggressive dog and one that's simply barking or anxious. Mark scanned the list, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "This is good. If we'd had this knowledge in place a few weeks ago..." He trailed off, not wanting to dwell on the past, but Reed nodded grimly, finishing the thought. "Then we wouldn't have traumatized your old friend." Later that same day, Mark took Duke to the vet for a routine senior checkup. Given the dog's recent stress, it seemed like the right move. Dr. Menendez, the longtime family vet, was relieved to see that Duke's heart rate and weight hadn't deteriorated. "He's a tough old boy," Dr. Menendez said, patting Duke's side. "The stress might have caused a few sleepless nights, but physically, he's holding up. Just keep an eye on those joints." Mark exhaled, not realizing how tense he'd been. "So, he's good to go for a small public event in a few days?" The vet chuckled. "If it's not too overwhelming, sure. Just watch for signs of fatigue, and if he wants to lie down, let him." As Mark left the vet's office, his phone buzzed. The screen displayed an unknown number. He hesitated but answered. A woman's voice, nervous and hesitant, introduced herself. "Hello. I'm the one who wrote you that letter. The mother who called the police about a dangerous dog." Mark froze, his heart pounding. This was the first time he was speaking directly to her. He stammered. "Thank you for reaching out." She sighed audibly. "I'm really sorry. My kids were scared by a big dog in the alley, and I guess Duke fit the description. I never expected the cops to be so aggressive. I wanted to come see him and apologize in person." Her voice trembled with regret. A rush of conflicting emotions, anger, empathy, and relief swirled inside Mark's chest. "Okay," he said gently. "If you really want to, we can meet. Duke's older, but he's friendly." "I'd like to clear the air," she said. Arranging a meeting at Mark's yard, ironically the very place where the first incident had unfolded, set Mark's nerves on edge. Would she be distant, or would she genuinely express remorse? Did she have an explanation for how things had escalated? The potluck had glossed over the source of the call, and while many speculated it was the new family on the block, no one knew for sure. As the day of both the outreach event at the shelter and this personal meeting approached, Mark found himself swinging between tension and cautious hope. If this mother truly never meant any harm, Maybe they could clear up the misunderstanding and bring final closure to Duke's ordeal. Ms. Flanagan, hearing the news, offered to stand by for moral support. And if she tries to blame you again, we'll set the record straight, she added, winking. Duke, for his part, carried on as if nothing had ever happened. He'd nap in the sun, stretch out lazily, and sometimes wander toward the fence to greet passers-by with a wag of his tail. Mark patted his old friend's side, finding comfort in the dog's unshakable calm. We'll get through this last chapter, buddy, he thought. Then maybe we can really rest easy. The sun hung low over Mark Winter's backyard the afternoon he was set to meet the anonymous caller, a young mother who had mistakenly reported Duke as a dangerous dog. She had briefly identified herself as Michelle on the phone, her voice tense yet earnest. Now, Mark stood near the fence, trying to steady his breathing. This was the very spot where officers had once cornered Duke, and the irony wasn't lost on him. Duke, for his part, remained inside the house, unwilling to be dragged into another potentially tense situation. Misty Flanagan and Mr. Leonard had volunteered to be nearby, quietly stationed in their yards, ready to step in or provide support if needed. Detective Reed was also aware of the meeting, though he'd respectfully refrained from attending in uniform, trusting Mark to handle things unless something went wrong. At exactly 4 o'clock, a silver sedan pulled up in front of Mark's house. A woman in her early 30s emerged, glancing around nervously as she shut the car door. She wore a hoodie and clutched a small purse against her side. Mark waited by the open gate, offering a polite nod. "Michelle?" he asked softly. She managed a shaky smile. "Yes, that's me. Thank you for letting me come." Her eyes flickered briefly to the patch of yard behind Mark, almost expecting to see the dangerous dog from the complaint. When she saw no sign of Duke, her shoulders relaxed slightly. They exchanged pleasantries. Mark introduced himself, briefly mentioned how Duke was doing, and gestured toward the chairs in the yard. Michelle took in the carefully mowed grass and the quiet setting, her gaze heavy with regret. Finally, she offered a single sentence that seemed to carry the weight of everything. "I'm sorry it turned out this way." Sitting in the folding chairs, Mark noticed Michelle's restless posture, her knees bouncing, fingers twisting nervously at her purse strap. She inhaled deeply and then spoke quickly. "I only moved here a few months ago. My kids kept seeing a big dog near the alley, barking aggressively. They got spooked. I asked the neighbors, but no one seemed to know who the dog belonged to, so I panicked and called the police." Her voice quivered with lingering guilt. Mark nodded, recalling how the stray dog, Scout, had indeed been roaming the alleys back then. "So you reported a big, threatening dog." The officers showed up, found my old Duke instead of the real stray, and, well, he shrugged, letting the memory of that confrontation speak for itself. Michelle's face flushed red. "I never wanted them to act like that. I thought they'd just check around, maybe talk to the owners. Next thing I know, I'm hearing they cornered an old dog and traumatized everyone involved." Then the story spread, and I felt horrible. That's why I wrote that letter. Mark listened, arms loosely folded across his chest, a mixture of empathy and frustration stirring within him. "I understand why you were worried about your kids," he said softly. "But the officers didn't handle it calmly. Duke was pinned down, basically harassed. He's never been the same around strangers in uniform." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I appreciate your apology, though. It really means a lot." Michelle's eyes welled up with tears. "I saw the news about your dog being innocent, how he's old with arthritis and everything. It broke my heart imagining him trembling in his own yard. I just hope you can forgive me." I honestly didn't know it would blow up like this." She wiped at her cheeks, relieved to see Mark's posture soften. Sensing the conversation could benefit from meeting the dog himself, Mark stood up. "See how Duke reacts?" Mark asked, gently mimicking a tense approach toward the dog. Duke stiffened, his ears flicking forward in mild confusion, but he didn't move aggressively. Mark paused and explained, "When you're approaching a dog, especially one like Duke, it's all about reading their body language. They'll often give signals, like backing up or turning their body, that tell you they're not a threat, just unsure or defensive." Detective Reed added, "It's all about being patient and assessing the situation calmly before taking action. Not every barking dog is a danger." Mark nodded, looking at the group of recruits. Dogs like Duke, especially older ones, have their own rhythms. They're not always quick to respond the way a younger dog might, but they shouldn't be assumed to be aggressive just because they're defensive. The recruits were beginning to pay closer attention now, some taking notes while others exchanged glances that indicated understanding. It was clear that this demonstration, simple yet powerful, was opening their eyes. One of the recruits, a young woman with a ponytail, raised her hand. "How would we know if a dog is actually aggressive then?" Mark took a deep breath before responding, careful not to sound too dismissive. "It's about behavior patterns, not just appearance. An aggressive dog will posture in ways that show they're ready to attack, baring teeth, stiff legs, ears flattened to the head. A dog that's just scared or defensive will often try to back away rather than confront you directly." The room was quiet as the recruits absorbed this new perspective. Mark could feel that something important was taking place. It wasn't just about teaching them to handle calls more carefully. It was about changing the way they thought about dogs and their behavior, which would help prevent future misunderstandings like what had happened with Duke. Reed followed up, "This is why we're focusing on real-world examples. Mark's been gracious enough to share his experience with us, and now we have an opportunity to understand things from the perspective of a dog owner." After the demonstration, there was a brief Q&A session where officers asked about specific dog behaviors, and Mark patiently explained, drawing on his years of experience with Duke. He spoke about the different kinds of barks, how dogs communicate through their eyes, and how they use their bodies to express comfort or distress. As the session wrapped up, Reed thanked Mark and Duke for their time. "We'll take what we've learned here and try to apply it more thoughtfully in the future. Hopefully, this makes a real difference in the way we approach these kinds of calls." Mark smiled, feeling a wave of relief. "Thank you for making the effort. It means a lot to me. And to Duke." Duke, meanwhile, had been quietly lying by Mark's side throughout the demonstration, tail thumping gently against the floor as if he understood the significance of the moment. Mark scratched his dog's ears. "Good job, buddy," he whispered. "You helped more than you know." As they walked out of the precinct, Mark felt a quiet satisfaction. The awkwardness of the past was still there, but it was slowly being replaced with the sense that something positive had come out of the entire ordeal. The lesson wasn't just for the police, it was for the entire community. With a little more patience, understanding, and a willingness to see things from a different perspective, they could prevent another situation like the one that had so deeply affected Duke, and hopefully avoid the kind of mistakes that had led to the trauma. Back at home, Mark and Duke returned to their peaceful routine. The neighborhood had settled down, and even though things hadn't been perfect, there was a new sense of mutual respect in the air. As Mark looked out over his yard, with Duke resting beside him, he allowed himself a moment of gratitude for the lessons learned, both hard and gentle. Duke flinched as he eyed the uniform, a subtle uncertainty in his eyes. "That's how we met," Mark remarked with a rueful smile. which elicited a few soft chuckles from the recruits, their smiles tinged with guilt. Detective Reed, observing the moment, added, "In many cases, verifying a dog's behavior before escalating is crucial. A real sign of aggression might include snarling, raised hackles, or a stiff posture. But if all you see is a trembling or confused dog, approach calmly with non-threatening body language and always confirm the dog's condition." Older dogs often can't run or attack as expected. One of the recruits raised their hand from the back of the room. "What if we can't tell if the dog is truly old or just feigning submission? Could it still be dangerous?" Mark gently coaxed Duke to approach the recruit. The dog sniffed the officer's hand, tail wagging weakly. "You can't always be sure," Mark admitted. "But that's why you approach with caution, not aggression. This old fellow can barely trot across the yard, let alone mount an attack. A few seconds of observation can clarify a lot." The officer, sensing Duke's gentle nature, gave him a soft pat on the neck. "I see your point," he murmured. The tension in the room lifted as more recruits approached Duke, realizing that beyond his initial bark and big dog appearance, the dog's mild temperament was clear. After the demonstration, Reed concluded with a reminder. "We're not telling you to let your guard down, but we are telling you to use your judgment, rely on facts, not fear or hearsay." Polite applause followed, and Mark, feeling a mixture of pride and relief, thanked the group. Duke, sniffing around the edge of the briefing room, seemed to sense the friendly mood. One rookie asked for a photo with him, and soon half a dozen others joined in, capturing memories of the old dog who had unwittingly become a local symbol of misidentification. On the drive home, Mark glanced at Duke in the rearview mirror. The elderly shepherd mix was dozing, his muzzle resting on a cushion. "We've come a long way, buddy," Mark thought, "from fear and confrontation to understanding and teaching." The day had been a small victory, proof that hearts and habits could change when people embraced empathy. Still, Mark knew that not every situation would resolve so peacefully, but if more officers took a moment to assess, and more neighbors hesitated before making questionable calls, maybe fewer dogs and families would endure the trauma Duke had faced. It was a start, and for Mark, that hope was enough to move them forward. One mild autumn evening, Mark stood in his yard, Duke resting by the garden fence, soaking in the last rays of sunlight. Despite the progress since the police incident, a lingering restlessness hung in the air, as though the neighborhood was still waiting for closure. Mark had sensed this too. He and Duke had visited the police station, the neighborhood had rallied around them, and the real stray had been returned to its owner. Yet, some unspoken tension remained. Then, one evening, Mark received a phone call from Jasmine Moore, a local news reporter who had covered the original incident. "We'd love to do a follow-up piece with you and Duke," she said, her voice gentle. "Show the positive outcomes, the changes in dog-related calls." Mark hesitated. The thought of cameras in his backyard again unsettled him. Duke's calm days were precious, and he didn't want to stress the old dog with another round of media attention. But as he considered it, Mark realized that the story had sparked genuine change. Neighbors cooperating, new police training modules, and less fear toward misunderstood dogs. Maybe it was worth a little inconvenience. "All right," Mark agreed softly. "But keep it low-key. Duke's not the most energetic star around." News of the upcoming interview spread quickly. Mrs. Flanagan insisted on tidying Mark's yard, making sure everything looked perfect. Mr. Leonard Kane joked about watching the filming from a discreet corner. "Never thought our quiet suburb would attract so many cameras," he laughed. Others, however, were more skeptical. Would the piece truly reflect the community's unity or sensationalize the conflict? Mark shrugged, trying to stay hopeful. If Detective Reed or one of the newly trained officers appeared on camera, it could show real progress. We either trust this reporter or we stay silent, he said to Mrs. Flanagan. And staying silent won't fix misunderstandings. On the day of the interview, Mark woke early, brushing Duke gently. The dog tolerated the attention with patient dignity, as if he understood his role. Mark laid out a soft blanket in the yard for Duke to relax on during the interview. By mid-morning, Jasmine Moore arrived with a single camera operator, no big crew or production van. Detective Reed pulled up shortly after, stepping out in plain clothes, not wanting to intimidate Duke with a uniform. "I don't want him to feel threatened by all the official gear," Reed explained with a small grin. Jasmine greeted them warmly, praising Duke's calm demeanor. The dog, recalling Reed as one of the officers who had approached him kindly, gave a slow wag of his tail. Mark felt relieved that the atmosphere was already relaxed. The interview began with Jasmine summarizing the initial crisis, a mistaken complaint, an elderly dog wrongly treated as a threat, and the community's effort to find the true stray. She then turned to Mark. "How have you seen the neighborhood change since everything happened?" Mark glanced down at Duke, rubbing the old dog's ears. "At first, I was angry that my innocent dog was cornered in his own yard, but after that, people stepped up. We found the real stray, helped him return home, and the police department recognized the need for better training. It feels like we're closer as neighbors now." Jasmine's camera operator nodded, capturing the quiet warmth of the yard. Then, Jasmine asked, "Some critics argue the police overstepped, that they harassed Duke. Do you feel justice was served, or do you still harbor resentment?" Mark's expression tightened slightly. "I can't lie, I was upset. But a couple of the officers, especially Detective Reed here, apologized and took steps to ensure it doesn't happen again. I'd rather see progress than carry resentment forever." Reed cleared his throat. "We made mistakes. We can't change that day, but we've implemented new protocols for dog-related calls, focusing on observation and verification. We're also working with local rescues to handle stray complaints more humanely." He glanced at Duke. "This dog's ordeal opened our eyes to how fear can escalate if we don't slow down and assess." The interview continued smoothly until a voice interrupted from beyond the fence. "How are you all praising a dog that never should have been threatened in the first place?" Mark recognized the voice, Mr. Chandler, a neighbor known for his blunt opinions. He approached, arms folded. "I get that you're trying to fix things, but this could have ended in a dead pet. Doesn't that deserve more accountability?" The camera turned to capture the confrontation. Mark tensed, remembering Chandler's outspoken rants on the neighborhood forum. But he understood the man's concern. Many had feared a more tragic outcome. Reed raised his hands in a calm, non-confrontational gesture. "We understand your concern, sir. That's why we're here, admitting wrongdoing and establishing better practices to prevent tragedies." Chandler huffed. "We'll see," he muttered, turning away and walking off, leaving an uneasy silence behind him. Mark exchanged a nervous glance with Jasmine, unsure if the camera would frame the tension as evidence the department hadn't done enough. Jasmine, sensing the unease, gently steered the conversation back. She asked Mark about Duke's health and daily routine, then wrapped up the interview with an optimistic question. "Would you and Duke be involved in future community events to promote better neighbor-officer relations?" "Absolutely," Mark replied. "If Duke's up for it, we'll stand by any effort that fosters empathy. We've seen how fear and miscommunication can do real damage, but we've also seen how understanding and humility can bring a neighborhood together." As the camera cut, Jasmine smiled. I'll make sure to highlight the sincerity I've witnessed here. It's heartening to see real steps, not just talk. After the interview aired, the local news segment sparked a wave of positivity in the community. Neighbors who had only heard pieces of the story now saw the full picture, Detective Reed acknowledging mistakes and Mark speaking about empathy and caution. The footage of Duke, gray-muzzled and calm, painted a powerful image. Over the next week, Mark noticed a shift in the neighborhood. People stopped him during errands to compliment him and Duke, some even asking about volunteer opportunities at the local shelter or the new police training modules. Mrs. Flanagan beamed whenever she recounted the segment, proudly telling everyone, "Did you see old Duke on TV? What a star!" The full interview quickly went viral, gaining attention on social media, with many praising Mark's calm approach and the police's willingness to reform. Some skeptics remained, but the majority applauded the resolution. "It's nice to see a story end without tragedy," one comment read. Then, one afternoon, Mark received an invitation from the local precinct. It read, "You are cordially invited to a small ceremony recognizing community members who have promoted positive reform in animal-related calls. Please join us as we honor Duke, Mark Winters, and others who have helped shape our new policies." Mark blinked at the thick cardstock, a wave of emotions washing over him. He remembered the fear and anger from that day in the yard, never imagining such an honor would come from it. Glancing at Duke, who blinked back sleepily, Mark smiled. "You're the real hero, buddy. I guess we can manage one more ceremony." On the day of the ceremony, Mark and Duke arrived at the precinct's modest courtyard, where a small group had gathered. Captain Ellis, who had led the department's reforms, stood by the podium, waiting for the ceremony to start. The quiet gathering felt solemn and reflective, acknowledging past mistakes and future steps toward healing. Mark couldn't help but smile at Duke, who seemed completely unaware of the significance of the moment, content simply to be by his side. It was a moment of collective responsibility, marking the progress made and the work still to be done. Subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories of resilience and hope, and don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Your support helps us continue this vital work, one life at a time. Let's keep the flame of compassion burning brightly, because together we can make miracles happen. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.